This isn't just another flare-up in global trade or a routine negotiation tactic. We are witnessing a genuine historical anomaly. For the first time in the modern era, an American president has fundamentally lost control of a trade war he ignited. And the most surprising part is who just walked away from the table: Canada. Often dismissed as the quiet neighbor that American politicians take for granted, Canada has triggered the exact geopolitical nightmare that Donald Trump promised would never happen. To understand the gravity of this collapse, we have to look at the timeline of the 1st of February 2025, when Trump signed executive orders imposing a sweeping 25% tariff on nearly all Canadian goods, with energy products hit by a 10% levy. By invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a tool reserved for dire national security threats, he effectively bypassed the very USMCA trade agreement he had previously touted as his crowning achievement. The stated justification was the flow of fentanyl, despite U.S. customs data showing that a negligible amount of the seized drug actually enters via the northern border. It was a move rooted more in political theater than border security, designed to send a message of absolute dominance. However, the polite Canadian response was a calculated counterstrike of unprecedented scale. Ottawa immediately retaliated with $30 billion in tariffs, targeting iconic American exports: orange juice, peanut butter, wine, and motorcycles. But within 3 weeks, that figure spiraled to a staggering $155 billion. They hit every sensitive American economic pressure point: steel, aluminum, automobiles, and the entire agricultural heartland. Amidst this chaos, Canada saw a seismic political shift with the rise of Mark Carney to the role of Prime Minister. To grasp why this changed everything, you have to understand Carney's pedigree. He is the former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, the only person in history to lead the central banks of 2 different G7 nations. He doesn't just understand trade, he understands leverage and the plumbing of the global financial system. In a move that stunned Washington, Carney's opening salvo wasn't a request for a meeting, but a declaration of war. He stated that retaliatory tariffs would remain until the Americans show us respect. By shifting the goalpost from negotiation to respect, Carney signaled that Canada was no longer playing by the established rules of diplomacy. By August, the situation reached a breaking point as Trump escalated to 35% tariffs on non-USMCA qualifying goods, citing a circular logic of fentanyl, trade deficits, and Canada's own retaliation. It was an attempt at pure economic coercion, a gamble that Canada would eventually capitulate under the weight of the American machine. But Trump's fatal miscalculation lies in the unique DNA of the Canadian-American bond. Unlike China or Mexico, the trade with Canada is structural. Roughly 63% of Canadian exports to the U.S. are intermediate inputs: the energy that powers American factories, the lumber that builds their homes, and the raw minerals essential for their manufacturing. By trying to starve Canada, the U is effectively choking its own supply chain. We are no longer watching a trade war. We are watching a divorce where the partner who provides the electricity and the foundation just walked out and turned off the lights, leaving the world's largest economy to sit in the dark and wonder how it lost its most vital ally. When you choose to weaponize tariffs against intermediate inputs, you aren't just bruising an adversary. You are systematically dismantling the very nervous system of American industry. This reality prompted the Wall Street Journal, a bastion of conservative fiscal thought, to label this the dumbest trade war in history, bluntly stating that Donald Trump's justifications were untethered from economic reality. The markets, which usually find a way to price in political noise, finally hit a breaking point. On March 10th, the S&P 500 plummeted into correction territory, shedding 1% from its February peak and evaporating an eye-watering $4 trillion in shareholder wealth in a matter of weeks. April brought even darker days. Following the announcement of sweeping new auto tariffs, the S&P 500 cratered over 10% in just 48 hours, marking the most catastrophic trading week since the 2020 COVID-19 recession. American investors were finally staring down a truth that the White House refused to acknowledge. This wasn't a master stroke of negotiation. It was a profound act of economic self-harm. The conventional wisdom, and certainly the conviction held by Trump, was that Canada would eventually buckle because 75% of its exports flow south. The assumption was that the junior partner would always break first. But on January 16, 2026, Mark Carney shattered that assumption by landing in Beijing, becoming the first Canadian Prime Minister to visit China in nearly a decade. In a high-stakes summit with Xi Jinping, Carney secured a tectonic shift in trade. China agreed to slash tariffs on Canadian canola seed from 85% to 15% and remove punitive barriers on lobster, crab, and peas, effectively unlocking billions in frozen export orders. In exchange, Carney made a move that sent shockwaves through the West. He broke the unified front on Chinese electric vehicles. By slashing the 100% tariff Canada had previously mirrored from U.S. policy down to a mere 6.1% for a quota of 49,000 vehicles. Carney signaled that Canada was open for business on its own terms. Trump's reaction was visceral and immediate. Via Truth Social, he threatened 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods, dismissively referring to the Prime Minister as Governor Carney. This wasn't just a slip of the tongue. It reflected a deepening obsession, where Trump began sharing altered maps depicting Canada as a potential 51st state, framing the nation's survival as a gift from Washington. This was no longer trade policy. It had devolved into an annexationist fantasy. The climax of this defiance came on the 20th of January 2026 at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Standing on the global stage, Carney delivered a eulogy for the American-led century. He declared that the 80-year era of U.S. economic stewardship was dead, exposing the rules-based order as a convenient fiction, where the strongest were always exempt and trade rules were enforced only when they benefited the hegemon. His message to the middle powers of the world was a chilling ultimatum. The age of blind loyalty is over. Carney warned that in this new predatory landscape, nations must unite and act with cold-blooded autonomy, because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. It was more than a speech. It was a manifesto for a world where Canada no longer asks for permission to exist, leaving the United States to realize, perhaps too late, that their closest ally has finally stopped waiting for a seat at a table that no longer exists. Canada is no longer merely reacting to Washington. It is architecting a global coalition designed not to spite American interests, but to ensure survival in a world where American partnership can no longer be guaranteed. While European and Asian capitals hailed Mark Carney's Davos manifesto as a masterclass in middle power pragmatism, Donald Trump attempted to frame it as a blunder, claiming on social media that Carney had aggressively walked back his remarks in a private phone call. The Canadian Prime Minister's response was a chilling display of diplomatic steel. Addressing a throng of reporters the next morning, Carney didn't just stand his ground. He doubled down, stating with surgical precision, To be absolutely clear, and I said this directly to the president, I meant every word I said in Davos. He then unveiled the scope of Canada's grand pivot and a staggering blitz of 12 new trade deals across 4 continents, all negotiated in a mere 6 months. The data trailing this pivot tells a story of a nation breaking its chains. Canadian exports to Europe surged by 22% within a year, while trade with Africa and South America climbed 18% and 11% respectively. While these gains don't yet fully replace the massive American market, they have reclaimed nearly a third of the lost volume, proving to the world that the indispensable American customer is in fact replaceable. By aggressively pursuing ties with India, ASEAN, and Mercosur, Carney's endgame is clear: to strip away the singular leverage Trump believes he holds, and to render American access non-essential to Canadian prosperity. The defiance has cascaded from the federal halls of Ottawa down to the provincial grassroots, creating a multi-layered economic blockade. In a series of independent power moves, Ontario purged American spirits and wine from its liquor store shelves. Nova Scotia doubled tolls for U.S. commercial vehicles on the vital Quebec-Wood Pass, and British Columbia mandated that all biofuels and gasoline be produced domestically, effectively evicting American energy firms from the market. In perhaps the most symbolic blow, Ontario canceled a $100 million contract with Elon Musk's Starlink. This isn't just a federal policy, it is a national mobilization. The shockwaves are tearing through the American heartland, where the human cost of Trump's trade war is becoming impossible to ignore. In Ohio, a state that exports more to Canada than its next 6 trading partners combined, the unemployment rate has spiked to 5%, one of the highest in the union. In Michigan, the automotive engine of America has begun to sputter and stall as plants, starved of Canadian steel and aluminum, face indefinite production delays, while U.S. refineries optimized for Canadian crude find themselves paralyzed, unable to pivot to alternative suppliers. The Bank of Canada's internal projections are admittedly grim, forecasting a 3% reduction in real GDP and a permanent loss of national income that the country may never fully recoup. With business investment cratering by 12% and consumer spending weakening under the strain, these figures represent a devastating blow to the Canadian way of life. Yet, in a move that has baffled the White House, Canada has chosen to lean into the pain. The Carney government has deployed a colossal $6.5 billion trade impact program, deferred $40 billion in taxes to provide emergency liquidity, and overhauled unemployment insurance to create a massive economic shock absorber for its citizens. Carney has made a cold, calculated bet that the temporary agony of a recession is a price worth paying for long-term sovereignty. He has convinced the nation that the cost of remaining tethered to an unreliable and erratic partner is far more dangerous than the cost of diversification, even if that path is paved with hardship. Canada isn't just weathering the storm, it is learning to sail in a different direction entirely, leaving the United States to realize that a neighbor who no longer fears you is a neighbor you can no longer control. While Mark Carney anchored Canada's future in global diversification, Donald Trump found himself ensnared in a domestic legal quagmire of his own making. In May 2025, a federal court delivered a staggering blow, declaring his tariff executive orders legally invalid. The Court of International Trade ruled that both the fentanyl-related levies and the subsequent reciprocal tariffs far exceeded presidential authority, placing them under a permanent injunction. Even as the appeals court affirmed this illegality in August, Trump chose to ignore the judiciary, maintaining the tariffs in a state of constitutional defiance. By September, however, the geopolitical landscape shifted again. In a move of brilliant strategic simplification, Canada unilaterally removed most retaliatory tariffs on USMCA-qualified goods. This wasn't a white flag of surrender. It was a cold realization that maintaining expensive enforcement on consumer goods only punished Canadian citizens. By keeping dollar-for-dollar retaliatory strikes on steel, aluminum, and autos while lifting the rest, Carney effectively exited Trump's game, refusing to let Canada's economy be defined by a circular trade war that the American courts had already deemed unlawful. The narrative from the White House remained that this was all negotiation theater, the art of the squeeze to get a better deal. But the reality was far more predatory. A negotiation assumes that both parties are seeking a mutually beneficial middle ground. Yet Trump's rhetoric had long since abandoned the language of trade for the language of conquest. He publicly mused that Canada would be much better off as the 51st state, dismissively describing the 49th parallel as an artificial line drawn with a ruler and characterizing the entire trade relationship as a generous American subsidy. These weren't opening bids, they were territorial claims. When Carney fired back that Canadian annexation will never happen, he wasn't talking about spreadsheets or duty rates. He was sounding the alarm on a fundamental threat to national sovereignty. Trump's strategy was never about better terms. It was about forcing an economic dependency so absolute that Canada would be coerced into a vassal state status. The Beijing deal, however, shattered that illusion of American omnipotence. By proving that Canada has viable, high-value alternatives, Carney flipped the leverage entirely, transforming Canada from a cornered target into a global free agent. This confrontation is part of a broader, more unsettling pattern of American expansionism that has sent shockwaves across the globe. From threatening Greenland with military seizure to posting maps that absorb Venezuela and Cuba into American territory, the White House has signaled an intent to rewrite the geography of the Western Hemisphere through raw economic coercion. At Davos, Carney didn't just speak for Canada, he spoke for every middle power currently watching the American-Canadian divorce with mounting dread. These nations are no longer waiting for the storm to pass. They are actively architecting an era of de-Americanization. They are building payment systems that bypass the U.S. dollar, supply chains that route around American ports, and trade blocs that treat the U.S. as a risk to be managed rather than a partner to be followed. As the 2026 USMCA review looms, the stakes have shifted from preservation to separation. Carney has publicly stated that while he hopes for respect, he is preparing for a world without it. The message is unmistakable. Canada is no longer just looking for a new trade partner. It is building the infrastructure for a total economic divorce, proving that even the closest of neighbors will choose the hardship of independence over the security of a cage. In a display of supreme confidence, Donald Trump recently characterized the situation as a one-way street, where tariffs are the only tool and negotiation is a luxury he needn't bother with, suggesting there is zero urgency to strike a deal because Canada must eventually either submit or wither. But he is working from an obsolete playbook. Canada isn't waiting in the lobby for an audience. They are actively walking out the door. What American workers must urgently realize is that when global supply chains reorganize, they don't simply snap back once the political winds shift. When a Canadian mining giant redirects its copper flow to European tech hubs, or an energy titan invests billions in the infrastructure required to feed Asian markets, those are not temporary detours. They are permanent structural pivots. They won't tear down multi-billion-dollar pipelines or dissolve long-term Asian contracts just for the sake of an American reconciliation that may never come. By July 2025, The damage was already visceral. Oxford Economics Group reported that U.S. tariffs on Canadian vehicles and parts bled over $380 million in a single month, causing the share of duty-free Canadian imports to crater from nearly 100% to a mere third. For the big three, Ford, GM, and Stellantis, the integrated cross-border production model that defined North American industry for decades has become economically unviable overnight. These companies aren't just hurting, they are fleeing, relocating production not to the American Rust Belt, but to Mexico and Europe, where trade logic still prevails. Trump promised a manufacturing renaissance. Instead, he is presiding over a great export of American jobs to nations that didn't choose to set their house on fire. The domestic consequences are unfolding in real time like a slow-motion wreck. While the U.S. managed to dodge a technical recession in early 2025, the projections for 2026 are being slashed with every passing week as consumer confidence plummeted 11% this March. Bloomberg has called the tariff rollouts baffling, while 60% of the American public, rightly sensing the impending bill, expects a massive spike in the cost of living, because tariffs are essentially taxes paid by American importers. Every grocery item, gallon of gas, and smartphone with Canadian components is becoming a luxury. If Trump follows through on his threat of 100% tariffs, the American consumer will be paying double for the privilege of a trade war they never asked for. Meanwhile, across the border, the Carney pivot is in full swing, signing historic deals with China, Europe, and India. Canada isn't diversifying out of spite, they are doing it for survival. They are building a post-American economy because they have been forced to recognize that the partner they once trusted is now a predator. Everything now hinges on the 2026 USMCA review. If that framework collapses, the war becomes a permanent state of being, sending energy prices into the stratosphere and making American manufacturing costs explode to the point of insolvency. Trump's entire gamble is built on the arrogant assumption that Canada will panic first, that the sheer weight of American economic gravity will force Carney to his knees. But leverage only works if the party being threatened fears the loss more than they value their freedom. Canada has just sent a message that has echoed through every capital in the world. They value their sovereignty more than their access to the American market. Trump entered this arena believing he held all the high cards, but he failed to realize that economic interdependence is a double-edged sword. When you threaten the very survival of a partner, they cease to be a partner and become an opponent, with absolutely nothing left to lose. And as history proves, an opponent with their back against the wall makes decisions based on survival, not sentiment. The question is no longer whether Canada can survive without the United States. They've already moved on to answering how they will thrive in spite of it. It is a sobering reality to face, but the data is undeniable. Canada can survive this. It will be painful, it will be expensive, and it will require a generational shift in their national identity, but they are already doing it. The real unspoken question haunting the halls of power is whether the United States can survive without Canada. Can we sustain our way of life without the cheap, reliable energy, the essential raw materials, and the intricately woven supply chains that have made American manufacturing a global titan for a century? Donald Trump staked the entire American economy on a high-stakes gamble that Canada would blink first. They didn't. Now he finds himself trapped in a strategic corner of his own design. Escalate further and trigger a certain localized recession, or back down and admit that his signature tariff war was a catastrophic failure. Neither path leads to the victory he promised. The true disaster unfolding isn't just the tariffs themselves or the retaliatory strikes, it is a total loss of American control. Trump can no longer force Canada to the negotiating table because under Mark Carney's strategic autonomy, Canada has simply stopped caring about American approval. You cannot threaten someone into submission when they are already building a new house with your competitors. You cannot claim a win when the economic fallout is mounting on both sides of the border with no finish line in sight. This is the inevitable conclusion of treating your most loyal ally like a hostile adversary and mistaking a shared border for a permanent leash. When you believe that threatening a nation's sovereignty will produce compliance instead of a fierce, unified defiance, you haven't just lost a trade deal, bizarrely, you've lost an era. Canada has just provided the world with a masterclass in how middle powers can survive great power coercion. You build new coalitions, you diversify your dependencies with surgical precision, and you accept short-term economic agony in exchange for long-term national autonomy. You call the bluff. And when the bluff is called, the world finally sees who actually held the leverage all along. Every nation from the EU to the ASEAN bloc is watching this play out and learning the same chilling lesson. American economic dominance is no longer an inevitability. It is a conditional state. And when the conditions of respect and stability are removed, the game changes forever. Trump believed he was starting a trade war to put America first. What he actually started was a global demonstration that American threats have limits and that sovereignty matters more than market access when survival is on the line. The map of global trade is being rewritten at this very moment, not in the West Wing, but in Ottawa, Beijing, Brussels, and New Delhi. While we sit on the outside looking in, new networks are solidifying and new partnerships are being signed in ink that doesn't wash away. Your grocery bills are climbing, your gas prices are surging, and your job security is evaporating, not because our neighbor attacked us, but because we attacked their right to exist as an independent nation. This isn't a negotiation gone wrong. It is a foundational relationship destroyed by a leader who couldn't tell the difference between strength and bullying. And in the world of global power, control once lost rarely ever comes back.